You know how sometimes you hear a story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world? This is one of those stories, and honestly, if someone had told me this a few years ago, I probably would have laughed it off. But after what I discovered during my investigation into what should have been a routine missing persons case, I can't sleep the same way anymore. It started like so many other cases. A young couple in their late 20s went out for what was supposed to be a 3-day hiking trip in the remote mountains of Northern California. They were the kind of people who did everything by the book, experienced hikers who always filed detailed trip plans, carried emergency beacons, and never took unnecessary risks. When they didn't show up at their scheduled pickup point 3 days later, their families immediately knew something was wrong. The initial search seemed straightforward. Their car was found exactly where it should be, parked at the designated trailhead with all their gear properly locked away except for what they'd packed for the hike. No signs of forced entry, no indication they'd been in any kind of trouble before heading into the wilderness. The vehicle registration and permits were all in order, their hiking plan was filed with the ranger station, and everything suggested they'd simply walked into the forest and vanished. But that's where things started getting weird. The first search team found their initial campsite about 6 miles from the trailhead, right where their filed plan said it would be. The location made perfect sense, a small clearing beside a stream with good water access and natural windbreaks. But when the searchers examined the site more closely, they started noticing things that didn't add up. The tent was still standing, properly staked and guy-lined like experienced hikers would do it. Their camp chairs were arranged around a cold fire pit with stones carefully placed in a circle. Everything looked normal at first glance, but the food situation was what really caught the search team's attention. All their bear-proof containers had been opened, but not in the way a bear would do it. Bears are messy, they scatter things, leave claw marks, tear packaging apart. This was different. The containers were methodically opened, the food inside carefully removed, but not eaten on the spot. Instead, it looked like someone had systematically gone through their supplies and taken specific items while leaving others untouched. What made this even stranger was the selection of what was taken versus what was left behind. High-energy items like trail mix, energy bars, and dried fruit were completely gone. But canned goods, which would be harder to open without tools, were left untouched. Seasoning packets and condiments were taken, but bulk items like pasta and rice were ignored. This wasn't random foraging. It was selective harvesting that showed understanding of which foods would be most useful. The containers themselves told another part of the story. They hadn't been damaged or forced open. Instead, someone had figured out how the locking mechanisms worked and had opened them properly. Bear-proof containers are specifically designed to be difficult for animals to operate, requiring a combination of dexterity and problem-solving that's supposed to be beyond wildlife capabilities. But perhaps most unsettling was what we found when we examined the area around the food storage more carefully. In the soft earth beside the containers, we discovered partial footprints that were unlike anything any of the searchers had seen before. They were massive, easily twice the size of a normal human footprint, and showed what appeared to be 5 distinct toes with claw marks extending beyond each digit. The search dogs had a strong scent trail leading away from this first campsite, heading deeper into the wilderness. But here's what made everyone uncomfortable. The trail didn't follow any of the established hiking paths. Instead, it led straight into dense forest where no reasonable hiker would choose to go, especially not with full packs. What we discovered through careful analysis of the evidence was that the couple's encounter didn't begin when they reached their second campsite. It had been building from the moment they entered the wilderness. Going back through their GPS data and cross-referencing it with the physical evidence we found, a much more detailed and terrifying picture emerged. the stalking appears to have started on their very first night. When we examined their initial campsite more carefully with forensic techniques, we found subtle signs that something had been watching them from the forest edge during the hours of darkness. There were disturbed areas in the vegetation about 60 yards from their tent, spots where large bodies had clearly settled for extended periods, leaving compressed grass and broken twigs in distinctive patterns. These observation points weren't randomly located. They were positioned with clear sightlines to the couple's campsite, but remained hidden from anyone inside the camp. Each vantage point provided excellent visibility of the tent entrance, the food storage area, and the couple's evening activities around the fire. Whatever had been watching them understood the need for concealment while maintaining visual surveillance. The positioning showed tactical awareness that was deeply unsettling. Any one observation post could have been explained as coincidental animal bedding, but we found evidence of at least 4 different watching positions arranged in a rough semicircle around the campsite. This wasn't random, it was a coordinated surveillance operation. We also found evidence that their camp had been approached during the night while they slept. Large footprints in the soft earth around their tent perimeter, made during the hours of darkness when the couple would have been most vulnerable. The prints showed a careful, methodical circuit around their sleeping area, close enough to detect scents and sounds, but not close enough to wake them. The approach pattern was what really got our attention. The footprints didn't show the random wandering of an animal investigating a campsite. Instead, they formed a deliberate perimeter walk that circled the tent at a consistent distance of about 25 feet. Whatever made these prints had maintained that exact distance for a complete circuit, showing spatial awareness and control that was unlike any known animal behavior. Most disturbing was what we found near their food storage. The couple had properly hung their food in a bear bag about 50 feet from their tent, following standard wilderness safety protocols. But something had approached the suspended bag during the night and studied it carefully. We found those same massive footprints directly beneath the hanging food, and scratches on the tree trunk that suggested whatever made them had tested whether they could reach the bag. The scratches were deep gouges in the bark, made by claws or tools that were far too large for any known predator in the region. The mark started about 7 feet up the trunk and extended to nearly 9 feet high, indicating that whatever made them could reach much higher than any bear or mountain lion in the area. More significantly, the creature hadn't attempted to actually take the food during this first night. It had simply examined the setup and moved on. This suggested intelligence and restraint that was completely unlike normal animal behavior around food sources. Most predators would have made immediate attempts to access easy calories, but this creature had conducted what could only be described as reconnaissance. The couple's GPS data from their second day shows they began to sense something was wrong early in the morning. Their movement pattern changed from the steady, purposeful hiking of experienced outdoors people to something more cautious and paranoid. They made frequent stops, often doubling back to check areas they had already passed through. What the GPS data couldn't show, but what we discovered through physical evidence along their route, was that their growing unease was completely justified. Something was indeed following them, and it was conducting an increasingly aggressive campaign of psychological warfare. At several points during the day, the GPS shows them leaving the established trail system and moving cross-country through difficult terrain. This wasn't part of their original hiking plan, and the routes they chose made no sense from a navigation standpoint. When we examined these deviations, we found evidence of why they had been forced to change course. Along their intended route, we discovered freshly broken branches arranged in deliberate patterns across the trail. These weren't natural windfall or random storm damage. Someone had systematically created obstacles that would force hikers to find alternate routes. The branches were positioned at strategic points where the trail narrowed or passed through dense vegetation, locations where climbers would have no choice but to turn back or find another way around. But here's what made this truly sinister. The alternate routes all led in the same general direction, deeper into the wilderness, and further from any possibility of rescue or assistance. The couple thought they were making their own navigation decisions, but they were actually being herded like livestock toward a destination they couldn't see. We found evidence of their growing paranoia at 3 different locations along their route. At each spot, they had stopped for extended periods and set up temporary observation points behind rocks or fallen trees. The positioning of these stops suggested they were watching their back trail, trying to spot whatever they sensed was pursuing them. The physical evidence at these locations told the same story as the GPS data. We found areas where they had crouched for long periods, leaving body impressions in soft earth and scattered personal items they had set down while keeping watch. At the second location, we discovered they had tried to use binoculars to scan the forest behind them. The binoculars were left behind when they moved on, suggesting they had seen something that made them abandon the surveillance attempt. At the third observation point, we found they had attempted to use a small mirror to watch their back trail without exposing themselves, a technique taught in military survival training. The mirror was left behind, still positioned to reflect the path they'd traveled, but it had been deliberately smashed. Something had discovered their surveillance technique and had destroyed their equipment while they watched. But the most chilling discovery was that their pursuer had been aware of these tactics all along. At each observation point the couple had used, we found evidence that something large had circled around through the forest to watch them from a different angle. The massive footprints showed that while the couple thought they were observing their back trail, they were actually being observed by something much more skilled at remaining hidden. The creature had effectively turned the couple's own surveillance attempts against them, using their stops and observation points as opportunities to get closer and study them more carefully. This level of tactical awareness and counter-surveillance capability was unlike anything documented in known wildlife behavior. On the afternoon of their second day, something happened that escalated the situation dramatically. The couple had stopped to eat lunch at a scenic overlook, a normal break that should have been routine and safe. But when we examined the site, we found evidence of the first direct contact between them and their stalker. The lunch spot was on a rocky outcrop with excellent visibility in all directions, the kind of place experienced hikers choose specifically because it offers security and situational awareness. The couple had followed proper protocols, spreading their gear in an organized fashion and maintaining good sight lines to all potential approaches. But something had approached them during this lunch break, coming from a direction they hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for. The footprints showed a route up the backside of the rocky outcrop, using terrain features and vegetation to remain hidden until the final approach. The creature had essentially used the landscape itself as camouflage, approaching from below where the couple's elevated position provided no advantage. The physical evidence suggested a tense confrontation that lasted for several minutes. We found scattered food wrappers and personal items that had clearly been dropped in haste. Their water bottles were knocked over and left behind, the contents spilled across the rocky surface. Most telling was the discovery of a hiking pole that had been snapped cleanly in half. The break showed tremendous force applied with surgical precision, far more strength than any human could manage, and more control than any known predator would demonstrate. But here's what was truly disturbing about this encounter: under duress. Their footprints showed careful, deliberate steps rather than the scattered pattern of panicked flight. This suggested the creature had controlled the encounter from beginning to end, allowing them to withdraw when it had accomplished whatever it had intended. Most significantly, we discovered that food items had been taken during this encounter, but not consumed on the spot. The creature had used the confrontation as an opportunity to systematically select and remove specific items from their lunch supplies. High-energy foods were taken while bulk items were left behind, showing the same selective intelligence we had seen at their first campsite. The creature had also left something behind, a clear message that couldn't be misinterpreted. Arranged in a neat line on the rock where the couple had been eating were 5 large stones, each about the size of a human head. The stones weren't native to the rocky outcrop. They had been carried from somewhere else and placed in a deliberate pattern that would be impossible to miss or mistake for natural occurrence. What happened next was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire ordeal. Rather than making another direct contact immediately, the creature began a systematic campaign of psychological harassment that continued for the rest of their time in the wilderness. The couple's GPS data from that afternoon and evening shows increasingly erratic movement patterns. They would hike for short distances, then stop abruptly and change direction. Sometimes they would backtrack along their own trail for significant distances before choosing a completely different route. This wasn't normal navigation behavior, it was the movement pattern of people who were being actively terrorized. The harassment campaign was sophisticated and relentless. We found evidence along their afternoon route of deliberate attempts to instill fear and paranoia. Trees had been freshly damaged in ways that created loud cracking sounds that would have been audible from considerable distances. Large rocks had been rolled down slopes to create threatening noises that seemed to follow the couple's movement. Most unsettling were the territorial markings that began appearing along their route. Deep scratches in tree bark at heights of 8 to 10 feet, far above what any known animal could reach. The scratches formed consistent patterns that appeared at regular intervals, creating a corridor of marked territory that the couple was being forced to travel through. These markings weren't random vandalism. They showed clear intelligence and purpose. The patterns were too consistent to be accidental, and the placement was too strategic to be coincidental. Someone was marking a specific route and ensuring that anyone traveling through the area would know they were in claimed territory. At their second campsite that evening, we found extensive evidence of the psychological pressure they were under. They had moved their camp location 3 separate times during the evening, each time choosing a more defensive position. The final camp placement was against a large rock face that protected their backs, with clear fields of view in all other directions. But their attempts at finding secure positions were systematically countered. At each camp location, we found evidence that the creature had positioned itself to observe them, choosing vantage points that negated whatever tactical advantage they thought they had gained. The pattern of footprints around their various camp positions showed that no matter where they moved, they were being watched by something that understood their defensive thinking better than they did. The couple had clearly realized they were dealing with something intelligent by this point. We found evidence they had attempted to lay false trails, backtracking and then leaving the main path at right angles to confuse a pursuer. They had also tried scattering their scent by walking through streams and over rocky areas where tracks would be difficult to follow. But the footprint evidence showed their tactics had been completely ineffective. Their stalker had seen through every deception and had continued to track them with no apparent difficulty. More disturbing, the creature had left clear signs that it was aware of their evasion attempts. We found footprints that deliberately crossed and recrossed their false trails, almost as if their pursuer was mocking their efforts. During the night at their second camp, the psychological pressure escalated dramatically. We found evidence of multiple approaches to their tent during the hours of darkness. Not attacks, but deliberate attempts to terrorize them through displays of presence and power. Large footprints circled their campsite repeatedly throughout the night, sometimes coming within 15 feet of their tent. At several points, the creature had clearly stood directly outside their tent for extended periods. We found deep impressions in the soft earth where something massive had remained motionless long enough to leave detailed footprint impressions showing individual toe marks and claw patterns. The positioning of these prints suggested the creature had been studying their tent, possibly listening to their conversations or monitoring their stress levels. Some prints were positioned directly in front of the tent entrance, other at the sides where the occupants' heads would be while sleeping. This wasn't random wandering, it was calculated intimidation designed to ensure the couple knew they were completely vulnerable. But perhaps most terrifying was evidence that the creature had actually manipulated their campsite during the night. Guy lines had been loosened and retightened, camp equipment had been moved and repositioned, and their food storage had been examined and rearranged. The couple had been sleeping while something intelligent and powerful had been systematically demonstrating its ability to access every aspect of their camp without waking them. Dawn brought no relief from the harassment. The couple's GPS data shows they broke camp before sunrise, clearly desperate to escape whatever was tormenting them. But their movement pattern from the beginning of that final day showed they were no longer making rational navigation decisions their will. The physical evidence along their route that morning told the story of escalating panic and desperation. We found personal items dropped at regular intervals. First, non-essential gear like extra clothing and camp chairs, then increasingly important items like cooking equipment and water purification tablets. Eventually, they were abandoning critical survival gear, including their sleeping bags, emergency shelter, and even some of their water supplies. They were lightening their packs for speed, but also showing signs of decision-making impairment that comes with extreme stress and sleep deprivation. The pattern of abandoned items showed they were no longer thinking clearly about what they would need to survive in the wilderness. At 3 different locations along their morning route, we found evidence they had stopped and attempted to signal for help. At the first location, they had used a signal mirror to try to attract attention from any aircraft that might be overhead. At the second, they had built a small fire with green vegetation to create smoke that would be visible from a distance. At the third, they had arranged rocks and bright clothing in an SOS pattern that would be recognizable from the air. But each of these signaling attempts had been interrupted and destroyed before they could be effective. The signal mirror was found smashed against a tree, destroyed while they were still trying to use it. The signal fire had been scattered and stamped out while the wood was still burning, the unburned pieces arranged in a neat pile that showed deliberate interference rather than natural causes. The SOS pattern had been not just disturbed, but deliberately rearranged into a different configuration that made no sense as a distress signal. Someone had taken the time to move each rock and piece of clothing individually, creating a pattern that appeared random, but actually showed clear signs of intelligence and intention. This systematic interference with their rescue attempts showed that whatever was stalking them understood human distress procedures and was actively preventing any chance of outside assistance. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was ensuring they remained isolated and helpless. As we analyzed the couple's movement pattern throughout their final morning, a disturbing strategy became apparent. They weren't choosing their own route anymore. They were being herded like livestock toward a specific destination by something that understood exactly how to control human behavior. Every time they attempted to change direction toward easier terrain or routes that might lead back to safety, they encountered obstacles that hadn't been there the day before. These weren't natural barriers. They were deliberate blockages that forced the couple to continue in the direction their stalker wanted them to go. We found trees that had been freshly uprooted and positioned across potential escape routes. The trees were far too large for humans to move, and the placement was too precise to be accidental windfall. Someone with tremendous strength was actively modifying the landscape to create a corridor that led in only one direction. Large rocks had been rolled into positions that blocked access to easier paths. These weren't randomly fallen stones. They had been deliberately placed at strategic bottlenecks where the couple would have no choice but to turn back or find alternate routes. All the alternate routes led deeper into the wilderness, away from any possibility of help. Vegetation had been broken and twisted to create impassable barriers in locations that would force the couple onto more difficult terrain. Entire sections of undergrowth had been systematically destroyed to eliminate routes that might have led back toward the trailhead, while paths leading further into the mountains were left clear and inviting. The footprint evidence showed that multiple individuals were now involved in this herding operation. What had started as stalking by a single creature had evolved into a coordinated effort involving at least 4, possibly 5 different individuals working together with military-like precision. The prints showed they had taken up positions on all sides of the couple's possible routes, effectively creating an invisible fence that channeled movement in the desired direction. The coordination required for this operation suggested not just intelligence, but sophisticated communication and planning capabilities. This level of tactical coordination was unlike anything documented in animal behavior. The creatures were not just communicating with each other, they were executing a complex strategy that required long-term planning, real-time adaptation, and precise timing. They were demonstrating cognitive abilities that challenged everything we thought we knew about intelligence in non-human species. The couple's GPS data from late morning shows increasingly desperate attempts to break free from this invisible corridor. They would suddenly change direction at sharp angles, trying to escape through gaps in their pursuer's formation. But each attempt was quickly countered, with new obstacles appearing to block their escape routes and force them back onto the path their stalkers had chosen. The speed with which these countermeasures appeared suggested the creatures were in constant communication and could rapidly coordinate their responses to the couple's actions. When the couple tried to escape through a particular gap, that route would be blocked within minutes by freshly fallen trees or repositioned obstacles. By early afternoon of their final day, the couple's situation had become completely hopeless. The GPS data from this period shows movement patterns that were simply impossible for humans carrying packs over rough terrain to achieve under their own power. The most chilling aspect of the data was the speed readings. For several hours, the GPS recorded movement that was far faster than any human could maintain while running over difficult wilderness terrain. The couple appeared to have been carried or dragged through the forest at speeds that would have been impossible to maintain voluntarily. But this wasn't continuous rapid movement. Instead, the GPS showed bursts of high-speed travel interrupted by periods of complete stillness. This pattern suggested they were being transported for distances, then stopped while their captors regrouped or scouted ahead. During the stationary periods, we can only imagine the terror they must have experienced not knowing what was coming next or where they were being taken. The most heartbreaking aspect of the GPS data was how it showed the couple being separated for the first time. Throughout their entire ordeal, the 2 GPS units they carried had moved together, showing identical tracks as you'd expect from people trying to stay together for mutual support and protection. But during these final hours, the units began showing different positions. At first, the separation was minor, perhaps 50 to 100 yards apart, which might be explained by different routes around obstacles or terrain features. But as the afternoon progressed, the distance between the GPS units increased dramatically. By late afternoon, they were showing positions nearly half a mile apart, both still moving at those impossible speeds through terrain that would be challenging for experienced rock climbers with proper equipment. This separation pattern suggested something truly horrific. The couple had been split up, each being pursued or transported by different groups of their attackers. They were no longer together to provide mutual support or comfort during their final ordeal. Each was alone with creatures that were taking them to an unknown fate through wilderness that offered no hope of escape or rescue. After days of facing terror together, they had to endure their final hours in isolation, not knowing what was happening to their partner or whether they would ever see each other again. Along the routes tracked by the GPS units during those final hours, we found physical evidence that painted a terrifying picture of what the couple's last day was really like. They had been dropping items continuously as they were moved through the forest, either deliberately as signals for potential searchers or involuntarily as they were dragged through increasingly difficult terrain. The pattern of dropped items told its own story of escalating desperation and loss of control. Early in their forced march, they had been dropping non-essential gear, extra clothing, camp chairs, non-critical equipment. This suggested they still had some control over their situation and were making rational decisions about weight reduction to improve their chances of escape. But as the afternoon progressed, the dropped items became more critical to survival. Water bottles were found scattered along their route, then cooking equipment, then eventually items like their first aid kit and emergency shelter. By the end, they were losing things that no experienced hiker would ever abandon voluntarily. Clear signs they were no longer in control of their own movement or decision-making. Some of the most disturbing evidence came from how these items were distributed along the trail. Rather than being dropped in random patterns that would result from people losing gear while running or being dragged, many items were found arranged in deliberate displays that seemed intended to send specific messages. Personal belongings were hung from tree branches at eye level, where they would be easily spotted by anyone following the trail. Clothing was spread across rocks in patterns that showed clear intention rather than accidental loss. Important equipment was positioned at trail junctions where searchers would be most likely to find it. This careful arrangement of evidence suggested their captors understood that humans would eventually come looking for the missing couple. The creatures were leaving a trail that was easy to follow, almost as if they wanted to be tracked to specific locations. This behavior was completely unlike any known animal response to capturing prey. Most predators try to avoid detection when moving prey, but these creatures seemed to be deliberately creating a breadcrumb trail that would lead searchers to predetermined areas. This suggested not just intelligence, but an understanding of human search and rescue procedures, and possibly even a desire to manipulate the investigation in some way. As we followed the GPS tracks deeper into the wilderness, the evidence became increasingly disturbing. What we found wasn't just evidence of abduction, it was clear proof of systematic torture that had continued for hours as the couple was moved toward their final destination. At multiple locations along both GPS routes, we found areas where the units had remained stationary for extended periods. When we examined these sites, they told a story of deliberate cruelty that was difficult to accept even with the physical evidence right in front of us. These weren't rest stops or regrouping points, they were torture sites where the couple had been subjected to treatment that served no purpose except to inflict psychological and physical suffering. At the first torture site along one route, we found evidence that suggested one member of the couple had been forced to watch as their remaining supplies were systematically destroyed in front of them. Food packages were torn open and contents scattered, not for consumption, but apparently for psychological effect. Their remaining water had been poured out onto the ground, leaving empty bottles arranged in neat rows where the victim could see exactly what they were losing. The positioning of the scattered supplies showed this wasn't random destruction. It was a calculated display designed to break down psychological resistance by demonstrating complete powerlessness. The victim had been positioned to observe every aspect of the destruction, unable to intervene or prevent the loss of resources they needed to survive. At the second torture site, we found evidence of more direct physical intimidation. Large rocks had been thrown with tremendous force at trees near where one of the couple had been positioned, creating loud impacts and flying debris that would have been terrifying for someone who was already helpless and afraid. The rocks were far too large for humans to throw with any accuracy, and the impact patterns showed they had been hurled with precision that suggested deliberate targeting rather than random violence. The creature wasn't just demonstrating its strength, it was showing its ability to control exactly where that strength was applied. But it was the third torture site that provided the most disturbing evidence of calculated cruelty. Here we found clear signs that the creatures had put on an extended demonstration of their capabilities, apparently for the psychological benefit of their captive audience. Trees had been uprooted and snapped, not just broken, but twisted into impossible configurations that no natural force could have created. Boulders had been moved and stacked in formations that defied gravity and physics. Deep gouges had been carved into solid rock faces using what appeared to be nothing but claws or crude tools. These displays of strength weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to ensure complete compliance from the captives. The creatures were systematically demonstrating exactly what they were capable of, making it clear that resistance was not just futile, but would result in the immediate application of that overwhelming power against human bodies. The torture sites also showed evidence of the creature's understanding of human psychology. At each location, personal items belonging to the couple were arranged in ways that would maximize emotional impact. Photographs were positioned where they would be easily visible, reminders of the normal life the captives would never return to. Pieces of clothing were arranged to suggest what might happen to the people wearing them. The GPS data from late afternoon showed the most emotionally devastating aspect of the entire ordeal. The two units, which had been gradually separating throughout the day, suddenly diverged at sharp angles and began moving in completely different directions at high speed. This was the moment when the couple was permanently separated, torn apart after days of facing terror together. They would endure whatever came next alone without the comfort or support of each other's presence during their final moments. The emotional impact of this separation is almost impossible to imagine. After being together through days of stalking, direct confrontation, and hours of captivity and torture, they were split apart during the most critical moments of their ordeal. Each would face their fate in complete isolation, not knowing what was happening to their partner or whether they would ever see each other again. The GPS track from this point forward showed both units moving rapidly toward different areas of the remote canyon system. The routes were clearly planned in advance, not random movement through difficult terrain, but purposeful navigation toward specific destinations that the creatures had selected for reasons we could only guess at. One GPS unit moved toward the deepest part of the canyon system, following a route that would have been impossible for humans to navigate without specialized climbing equipment and extensive technical knowledge of the terrain. The other was taken to a more accessible area, but one that was equally isolated and far from any chance of rescue or discovery. This separation strategy showed sophisticated planning and resource management that was unlike anything documented in predator behavior. Rather than keeping their captives together, which would have been easier to manage and control, the creatures had made a deliberate decision to divide them. The reasons for this separation could only be speculated about, but the evidence suggested different fates were planned for each member of the couple. Perhaps they were intended to serve different purposes that required separate handling. Or maybe the separation itself was part of the psychological torture, ensuring that each victim's final moments would be spent in complete isolation and despair. The last recorded positions from both GPS units came within minutes of each other, despite being nearly a mile apart in extremely difficult terrain. This simultaneous ending of the electronic trail was too precise to be coincidental. It suggested careful coordination between the different groups that had taken the couple. The final ping for the first GPS unit came from deep in the canyon where the terrain became nearly impassable for humans. When search teams finally reached this location several days later, they found the GPS device itself, damaged but still functional, wedged into a crack in the canyon wall about 15 feet above the canyon floor. The positioning of the device was clearly deliberate. It hadn't simply fallen there during a struggle or been discarded randomly. Instead, it appeared to have been carefully placed in the rock crevice, positioned where it would be protected from weather, but would still be able to transmit its final location signal to searchers. This careful placement suggested their captors understood the technology and had deliberately positioned the device to provide searchers with a specific location to investigate. But when the search team reached the site, they found something that defied explanation. The area around the final GPS location showed extensive signs of activity, but not the kind of evidence you would expect from a typical predator kill site. Instead, the scene suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony had taken place there. Rocks had been arranged in complex geometric patterns around a central clearing. Trees had been stripped of their bark in precise spirals that created distinctive visual patterns. The ground itself had been carved with symbols that were clearly artificial, but unlike anything in any known human culture. But most disturbing was the complete absence of any physical remains. Despite clear evidence of prolonged activity at the site, there was no blood, no tissue, no fragments of clothing or equipment that might indicate what had happened to the person who had been brought there. The second GPS unit was never found, despite extensive searches of the area where its final signal had originated. The last ping came from a section of the canyon that was accessible to ground teams, but when searchers arrived, they found no trace of the device or any evidence of what had happened to the person carrying it. This selective preservation of evidence, saving one GPS unit while completely eliminating the other, suggested sophisticated decision-making by the creatures. They had chosen to provide searchers with one location to focus their investigation while completely obscuring what had happened at the second site. The asymmetry was clearly intentional, designed to ensure that investigators would find some evidence while remaining completely ignorant about other aspects of what had occurred. This level of strategic thinking about evidence management was unlike anything seen in animal behavior and suggested an understanding of human investigation techniques that was deeply unsettling. When search teams finally reached the location of the final GPS ping, they found signs of what could only be described as a desperate last stand. The area showed extensive disturbance over nearly an acre of canyon floor, broken vegetation, displaced rocks, and evidence of violent activity that had continued for an extended period. The scene suggested that despite everything they had endured, despite days of stalking and hours of captivity and torture, the couple had somehow found the strength to make one final attempt to fight back against their captors. We found evidence of improvised weapons gathered from the harsh environment, sharp rocks that had been collected and positioned strategically, broken branches that had been sharpened into crude spears. Areas where defensive positions had been constructed using available materials showed that even in their final moments, they had tried to work together to create some kind of tactical advantage. Rock piles had been arranged to provide cover, and thorny vegetation had been gathered to create barriers that might slow down attackers. But the evidence also showed the complete futility of their resistance. The defensive positions had been systematically overrun, the improvised weapons scattered and broken. Whatever they had faced in those final moments had possessed overwhelming advantages in strength, numbers, and knowledge of the terrain. The blood evidence at this site was more extensive than at any previous location, but it was still scattered over a wide area rather than concentrated in the pattern of a typical kill site. This distribution suggested a running fight that had covered significant ground before reaching its inevitable conclusion. Trails of blood evidence led in multiple directions from the central confrontation site, indicating that the final struggle had involved considerable movement and possibly multiple phases of conflict. But each trail ended abruptly with no indication of where the bodies might have been taken or what had ultimately happened to them. Most disturbing was evidence of systematic destruction that had taken place after the confrontation ended. The couple's remaining equipment had been methodically destroyed, not just scattered or damaged, but deliberately broken into pieces too small to be useful for any purpose. Clothing had been shredded into strips and scattered over a wide area. Equipment had been smashed beyond recognition, with metal components twisted into shapes that suggested tremendous force applied with deliberate intent rather than random violence. Personal items had been ground into fragments so small they were barely identifiable as having once belonged to human beings. Photographs were torn into pieces no larger than confetti. Electronic devices were crushed so thoroughly that even their basic components were unrecognizable. This destruction went far beyond what would be necessary to simply eliminate evidence. It was systematic obliteration that seemed motivated by something approaching hatred or rage. The thoroughness of the destruction suggested the creatures had spent considerable time and energy ensuring that every trace of the couple's humanity was erased from the wilderness. When the search and rescue teams filed their initial reports, the unusual aspects of the evidence created immediate problems for the official investigation. The massive footprints, the systematic stalking behavior, the coordinated herding tactics, and the sophisticated cleanup operations didn't fit into any established categories for wilderness disappearances. The first response was to classify the incident as a probable animal attack with bodies removed by predators, a convenient explanation that could account for the lack of remains while avoiding the more disturbing implications of the evidence. The massive footprints were dismissed as likely bear tracks distorted by weather and ground conditions over time. The systematic food removal from the first campsite was attributed to multiple bear encounters over several nights, despite the complete lack of typical bear sign like claw marks or scat in the area. The coordinated tracking patterns and territorial markings were explained as coincidental bear behavior that only appeared organized when viewed out of context. But even as the official explanation was being developed, investigators were quietly dealing with evidence that didn't fit the bear attack theory. Plaster casts of the clearest footprints were made and filed away, but they were never subjected to detailed analysis by wildlife experts or comparative studies with known animal tracks. The GPS data showing impossible movement speeds was attributed to device malfunction, despite both units showing similar anomalies and the devices being found in working condition. The final blurry photograph was dismissed as having no evidentiary value due to image quality, though no serious attempt was made to enhance or analyze the image using available forensic techniques. When family members requested access to examine the evidence more closely, they were told the case was closed and the materials had been transferred to archives that were not accessible to civilian personnel. Requests for independent expert analysis of the footprint casts were denied on the grounds that the case had been resolved and further investigation was unnecessary. Within weeks of the initial investigation, the case was officially closed and the file was sealed under provisions that restricted access to authorized personnel only. The search area was quietly designated as off-limits to public access. ostensibly for safety reasons related to unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife activity. Media coverage of the disappearance was carefully managed to focus entirely on hiking safety and the general dangers of venturing into remote wilderness areas. Press releases emphasized the importance of proper planning, adequate supplies, and staying on established trails. None of the unusual evidence was mentioned in official statements or media briefings. Several members of the original search team were quietly reassigned to other duties in different regions. Those who remained were instructed not to discuss the unusual aspects of the case with unauthorized personnel and were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements that went beyond normal protocols. What happened to that couple represents something far more significant than a single tragic incident. The evidence suggests they encountered representatives of a species that has learned to coexist with human expansion by perfecting the art of remaining hidden, while occasionally interacting with humans in ways that serve their own survival needs. These creatures appear to have developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding detection while maintaining awareness of human activities in their territory. The systematic food theft, the territorial markings, the coordinated herding tactics, and the careful management of evidence all point to intelligence that has adapted specifically to the challenge of remaining unknown in a world increasingly monitored by human technology. The creatures demonstrate understanding of human behavior that goes far beyond simple predator-prey relationships. They know how we search for missing people, how we investigate crime scenes, and how we process evidence. This suggests they've been observing human society for a long time, studying our methods and adapting their own behaviors accordingly. Each interaction with humans provides them with additional information about our capabilities and limitations, allowing them to refine their concealment techniques and avoid detection even as our technology becomes more sophisticated. The families of the missing couple never accepted the official explanation, and their refusal to remain quiet has created ongoing problems for the cover-up effort. The truth about what happened to them may be hidden from official acknowledgement, but it's not lost. It's waiting in the evidence for someone brave enough to look past the comfortable explanations and follow the trail wherever it leads. And that trail leads to one inescapable conclusion. We are not alone in the wilderness, and what shares it with us is far more intelligent, organized, and dangerous than we've been led to believe. For more interesting stories like this one, consider checking this out.